I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. As I am each week, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. And Elizabeth, today we're going to give some updates on previous cases we've discussed that are now going to be heard this week. What would you like to start with?
Yes, hey Chance, it's nice to be back. Today we're going to talk about the case of DeAndre Jerome Dortch. This is one of the people that we discussed a couple of weeks ago who is accused in a horrific 2016 child abuse case that involved children that were bound by the ankles and wrists with dog chains and leashes and left outside in the rain. That trial is actually scheduled to begin today. And just to remind you about this case, DeAndre Dortch was 36 when he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of injury to a child, serious bodily injury, after a neighbor called to report hearing children crying in a northeast side backyard in the wee hours of April 28th, 2016. Now, these were 2 children who were found in a backyard. This subdivision is called Camelot 2, and it's in far northeast Bexar County. So when sheriff's deputies arrived, they were attempting to do a welfare check in a home in the 8100 block of Chipping, and a neighbor had reported hearing children crying for several hours. And when deputies arrived, they found a boy, 4, and a girl, 3. They had numerous injuries. They were tied up by their ankles and their wrists. They were surrounded by their own feces. An official said at the time they believed the children had been left outside in the rain, possibly for several days. So Dortch and his, I want to say this was his girlfriend because they actually were parents together. His girlfriend, Portia Denise Phillips, 36, lived at this home with DeAndre. And they arrived probably right as these children were being freed. Again, they were outside in a backyard, and this was in the wee hours of the morning. I want to say possibly maybe it was after midnight for sure, but it was dark and it was April. That time of the late spring in San Antonio. You still can have some nights where it's pretty chilly outside, and the dew that lands on the trees and that sort of thing. I mean, it just really can be a chilly situation, and certainly for 2 children being held outside and not being able to move, that had to be a really bad situation. But Dortch and Phillips lived together at the home, and they told authorities that they were watching these 2 children for their friend Cheryl Reed, whom they said they knew from California, where each had lived before coming together to Texas. And Reed told authorities later on, after her arrest, that she had left her children in the care of Portia Phillips. So after the 2 children were freed that had been outside, deputies discovered Portia Phillips' 6 children between the ages of 10 months and 11 years old by themselves inside the home. So there was no adult present, and authorities at that time determined that at least 3 of those children inside the home were the children of DeAndre Dortch and Portia Phillips. So here we are today now. DeAndre Dortch, he's 38 years old now, and he's the first person to go to trial in the case. In October of last year, Portia Phillips pleaded guilty to 2 counts of injury to a child, serious bodily injury, and was sentenced to 50 years in prison on each count. And those sentences will run at the same time. And Cheryl Reed, the mother of those two children that were tied up like dogs outside, is currently still in the Bexar County Jail, and she is awaiting her trial, which we hear, should be coming up pretty soon. And again, this charge is injury to a child, serious bodily injury. This is a first-degree felony in Texas, punishable by up to 99 years or life in prison. And the case that, DeAndre Dortch's case that starts today is being heard in felony impact court with visiting judge Laura Parker presiding. So what we're going to learn this week is probably going to be just a lot more information as to how this just horrible tragedy, occurred, where these two children were left outside. A week after sheriff's deputies found these two children, it's a sister and a brother. Again, they were 3 and 4 years old. Investigators, were pretty hot on the case. The sheriff's office and Child Protective Services were basically on the case together, trying to, find out more information about these children and the specific, level of mistreatment that they might have suffered. I worked on a story at that time with a colleague of mine, Bruce Selcraig, just to try to delve a little bit more into the background or what might have happened with these two children. And what we were able to find out at the time, in days after this incident occurred, was that the boy was 4, was fastened to the ground outside this house where Dortch and Phillips were renting. He had a tight dog chain around one ankle, and his pants were down around his feet, and as he attempted to relieve himself, several piles of human feces were nearby. And 10 feet away from him was the 3-year-old, his younger sister, who also was tied with a dog leash, and she actually was attached to a garage door, and her wrists were bound above her head. And later on, after she was checked by doctors, they determined that her right arm was actually fractured in 2 places because she was probably trying to loosen herself, from the tether. They were dehydrated, they were cold, and they were hungry. They had scrapes on their legs, backs, wrists, and ankles. And investigators feel like those particular injuries had happened over a 2-week period. And this is information, again, that they had found out, in the days after the children had been discovered outside. And inside the home, this house, again, that was located in the Camelot 2 subdivision, and that's in far northeast Bexar County. Inside, they had only a couch for furniture, and the reports that we received at the time were that it reeked with the stench of backed-up toilets inside the house. There were clothes all over the floor. There was no parent home, again, when, authorities arrived. And the 2 children who were outside, their mother actually was pregnant at the time that her 2 children were found tied up outside. So, that just gives us a little bit more information about, about the kids and about, what we had known at the time. And it, it's really hard to find out more information, especially when you're dealing with minors, and especially if they're in the Child Protective Services system. I mean, you can only imagine the privacy that's involved in those particular cases. They'd never identify the children. and for obvious reasons. From what we've been able to learn so far before this particular trial starts, is that those two children, and likely the one that Cheryl Reed was carrying at the time, have been placed with relatives. And I believe also there might have been one other child that she had, but she has pretty much lost her parental rights with all of her children, because of this incident. And the children that were, the 6 children that were inside the home have also been placed. I believe some have gone back to California, where it seems that 3 of these suspects, defendants rather, have ties, familial ties probably, which is why some of these children were able to go back to California. And then there are others that, as case goes on this week, we're likely to find out more information as it comes out in court. But when something like this occurs, where like in this instance where children have been found and there's signs of abuse or neglect, Child Advocate San Antonio steps in to help with Child Protective Services, and what they do is they will assign a volunteer who will work with the children, and that will help them, place them with a family, and the volunteer will basically work with all those that are working with the children to make sure that they get food and they get health care, education, and psychological needs. Any psychological needs that they could have to make sure that they're met. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in this case. The children now, this was 2 years ago now, so the children who were bound outside now are likely 5 and 6 years old. But at the time that they were found and rescued by first responders and then taken for treatment and then placed in their homes, there were a lot of issues that the children were having. I'd spoken to a attorney ad litem at the time who was working with both of the children, and even the 4-year-old at the time had not even been potty trained yet and was still wearing diapers. And they were so malnourished that when they were eating like they had never seen food before, which was something that the ad litem had spoken about. But they were doing very well almost immediately with the people that they were placed with. So they had, because they had roots in California, and we really don't know how long Phillips and Dortch had been living in San Antonio. There were some child neglect reports involving Portia Phillips in the California Child Protective Services system. And when contacted, California CPS would not comment to us on any aspects of that case. But as far as we were able to learn at that point, until this instance, there had been no CPS history of them in Texas. So, that in itself is going to be a very, it's going to be a very sad trial, I imagine. We're going to hear a lot of evidence from people who were first responders on scene, and we're probably going to look at a lot of photographs. It's unclear whether or not the children will be called to testify. I imagine if they're so young, I imagine if they're already in in another relative's home, possibly, out of state, maybe in California, it may not be an issue, they may just decide not to do that, but it could be possible that we could hear, from a lot of witnesses who could tell us, what happened that led to this particular incident where these children were found, tied up outside, not exactly how long they were there and what might have happened with that. So that'll be a case that we will, most likely come back and take a look at. And I would anticipate at least a week, maybe a look for this trial to go on in Bexar County. So we will be talking more about that case.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. And then, Elizabeth, before we talk about our second case that we've previously discussed, and to give a little bit of a preview as that heads to trial, I'm interested, what's your indication of what the defense will say in this? Pretty much everything that you've said, I'm guessing, is not going to be disproven or challenged too much because it's been documented more or less. So what does a defense say in a case like this? Do they just try to plead for leniency? Or is that more in the sentencing phase? Like, what do you say when everything seems to be more or less as clear cut as you've made it so far in our discussion?
Well, what's interesting is that the night that the children were found, DeAndre Dortch and Portia Phillips were coming back from being somewhere. Now, it is a fact that DeAndre Dortch worked in a bar at a bowling alley in Leon Valley, and he was getting off of work, likely. I was in a hearing on Friday before this case, and what I could gather from basically what they were talking about in these pretrial hearings, what I'm anticipating is going to happen is that we're going to hear a lot about what he knew about why Cheryl Reed, the mother of those two children, actually left her children, with them, and for how long. Because those are little bitty babies. You're talking, little bitty babies, I'm going to just call them that because, they're 3 or 4 years old. And, at least, you kind of wonder when you've got children that young, it's a little difficult to leave them with, other people that they're not familiar with very much because they have a tendency to cry. So, it'll be interesting to find out, why they were left in the care of two people who are not related to her or to those children. And also, it's kind of a situation as well with Portia Phillips and DeAndre Dortch's children too, because even though they were not found in the same situation as the two children outside, they were still left alone, and they were inside of a house that just that had a couch and no plumbing that seemed to be working, according, to reports. So I would anticipate the defense on this case is probably going to, concentrate on the fact that he's not a relative of these children. He was out working, and he arrived as this discovery was being made. So depending upon how long his shift was, and also depending upon how long the children were outside, it'll be interesting to see what that testimony from first responders. I imagine we will look at a police interview with DeAndre Dortch. It's possible that maybe other interviews will be allowed into testimony. Interviews from Portia Phillips, because she's already made her deal with the DA's office and she's serving 50 years in prison. So, she could testify, or they could show her video, or they could just, concentrate on DeAndre Dortch and what his role could have been in, in however these children ended up getting tied up outside in a backyard and left out in the elements. So, again, it's a little unclear, but I imagine, in watching other cases, the defense is probably going to try to show people that, he lived in the house and some of those kids are his, but, he wasn't, he may not have been there, or he may not have been privy to, what was going on. And also this could have been, this could have actually, been something that happened between, the two women, because it's been almost 2 years now. At the end of this month, it'll be actually a 2-year-old case.
And then finally, Elizabeth, we just have a few moments left, but we can give a bit of a preview for a new trial for someone who originally was convicted quite a few years ago.
Yes, we talked about Janine Jones. She was dubbed the Angel of Death, convicted of murder in 1984 in a Kirk County case and sentenced to 99 years for killing 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan in 1982 with a fatal overdose of muscle relaxers. This is a case from the mid-'80s in Central Texas involving a former nurse who is believed by our Bexar County District Attorney Nicholas LaHood to be responsible for killing, anywhere from 40 to 60 children, maybe even more than that. A little bit of background on this is that she was an intensive care nurse. She worked at hospitals in Kirk County and in San Antonio, and the children who would come into her care would pass away. And how she was found, or how this particular pattern of children dying was found out, was that she was working in a hospital in Kerrville, and a child came in and ended up passing away. And they were able to, deduce that along with the children, they might have come in fine, and then they would go to the back. She worked for a pediatrician in Kerrville at the time, and she would take the children to the back and work on them. And this particular child that was in some sort of distress, she tried to revive her, and the child ended up dying. And that is the case that she was convicted of. And this is a more than 30-year-old case. And our district attorney last year began looking into some older cases here in Bexar County that happened along the same time in the mid-'80s as the particular case that sent Janine Jones to prison. And Nico LaHood was able to indict Janine Jones in 5 new murder indictments last year. And on December 7th, she was arraigned again in Bexar County on these 5 cases. And she pleaded not guilty to all 5 of them. And because this is going to be a very, very interesting case if it gets to trial. It is scheduled right now to go to court in July, and it was one of the big things that Nico LaHood campaigned on. He has always been an advocate for children, and he has a specific interest in seeking justice for children who have been, in any particular case where it involves children. And he took a very strong path toward wanting to make sure that Janine Jones would not get out of prison, because when she was convicted in '84, since then there was a new law that was passed that was aimed at easing crowding in Texas prisons. So she was set to be released in March, and had she not been reindicted by the Bexar County District Attorney's Office, she might have been free as of some particular date in March. So the DA's office was able to get enough evidence, I believe, to indict her in 5 more cases. So she was brought last December to Bexar County, and she's been waiting for trial in our jail since then. Now, Nico LaHood lost the Democratic nomination for DA, and it's probably one of the things. This case is probably one of the cases that are probably near and dear to his heart. And I have heard that this week we may be seeing a hearing for a speedy trial for Janine Jones. And if that happens, we probably, if that is granted by Judge Frank Castro, who has all of the cases in his 399th State District Court, we may be seeing a trial of Janine Jones way before July. Each of these cases, Nico had said last year, would be tried separately. But who knows? We could see something happen. I mean, anything could happen. She could get a new trial sooner than, or she could get a trial sooner than July, or she could take a plea. At the time in last December, it is possible that Nico LaHood could accept a plea bargain. He didn't rule it out back in December, but he did say that his main goal was that she take her last breath from behind bars. So we'll see, how that operates. But it's proving to be another busy time in court this week, especially with 2 cases that we have talked about before, and I'll be anxious to see these through and talk them over with you again.
Yeah, and unfortunately, both cases involving children, so there's that common thread as well. And yeah, it sounds like Elizabeth will be checking in with you sooner rather than later for the first case we discussed, and then this last one we're now talking about. We'll get that update about the speedy trial, but then of course you mentioned that is several months away, so we'll probably follow that into the near future as well. Well, of course, big thanks for my weekly guest, San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala, for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, where we discussed those two cases, one coming up a little sooner than the other, and we'll bring you more information for both of those cases right here on The Docket. You have a good week at the courthouse, Elizabeth, and we'll check in with you next week.
Thanks so much, Chance. Take care.
And of course, a big thank you to our weekly guest, San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala, joining me on today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.